To Teacup Reading and Fortune-Telling by Tea Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Roslyn Carlyle. Teacup Reading and Fortune-Telling by Tea Leaves by A. Highland Seer. Introduction. It is somewhat curious that among the great number of books on occult science and all forms of divination which have been published in the English language, there should be none dealing exclusively with the teacup reading and the art of telling fortunes by the tea leaves, notwithstanding that it is one of the most common forms of divination practised by the peasants of Scotland and by village fortune-tellers in all parts of this country. In many of the cheaper handbooks to fortune-telling by cards or in other ways, only brief references to the teacup method are given, but only too evidently by writers who are merely acquainted with it by hearsay, and have not made a study of it for themselves. This is probably because the reading of the teacups affords but little opportunity to the seer of extracting money from credulous folk. A reason why it was never adopted by the gypsy soothsayers, who preferred the more obviously lucrative methods of crossing the palm with gold or silver, or of charging a fee for manipulating a pack of playing cards. Reading the cup is essentially a domestic form of fortune-telling to be practised at home, and with success, by anyone who will take the trouble to master the simple rules laid down in these pages. And it is in the hope that it will provide a basis for much innocent and inexpensive amusement and recreation round the tea table at home, as well as for a more serious study of an interesting subject, that this little guidebook to the science is confidently offered to the public. End of introduction.
Of Teacup Reading and Fortune-Telling by Tea Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Charles Oldfield. Teacup Reading and Fortune-Telling by Tea Leaves. Chapter 1. Introduction to the Arts of Divination from Tea Leaves. It seems highly probable that at no previous period of the world's history have there been so many persons as there are at the present moment anxious to ascertain in advance, if that may be humanly possible, a knowledge of at least what a day may bring forth. The incidence of the greatest of all wars, which has resulted in sparse news of those from whom we are separated, and produces a state of uncertainty as to what the future holds in store for each of the inhabitants of the British Empire, is, of course, responsible for the increase in the perfectly sane and natural curiosity, with its inevitable result, a desire to employ any form of divination in the hope that some light may happily be cast upon the darkness and obscurity of the future. It is unfortunately the case, as records of the police courts have recently shown, that the creation of this demand for foreknowledge of coming events or for information as to the well-being of distant relatives and friends has resulted in the abundant supply of the want of scores of pretended fortune-tellers and diviners of the future, who, trading upon the credulity and anxieties of their unfortunate fellow-countrywomen, seek to make a living at their expense. Now it is an axiom, which centuries of experience have shown to be as sound as those of Euclid himself, that the moment the taint of money enters into the business of reading the future, the accuracy and credit of the fortune-told disappears. The fortune-teller no longer possesses the singleness of mind or purpose necessary to a clear reading of the symbols he or she consults. The amount of the fee is the first consideration, and this alone is sufficient to obscure the mental vision and to bias the judgment. This applies to the very highest and most conscientious of fortune-tellers, persons really adept at foreseeing the future when no taint of monetary reward intervenes. The greater number, however, of so-called fortune-tellers are but charlatans, with the merest smattering of partly assimilated knowledge of some form of divination or character-reading, whether by cards, coins, dice, dominoes, hands, crystal, or in any other pretended way. With these, the taint of the money they hope to receive clouds such mind or intuition as they may possess, and it follows that their judgments and prognostications have precisely the same value as the nostrums of the quack medicine vendor. They are very different from the Highlander who, coming to the door of his cottage or brothy at dawn, regards steadfastly the signs and omens he notes in the appearance of the sky, the actions of animals, the flight of birds, and so forth, and derives there from a foresight into the coming events of the opening day. They differ also from the spy wife, who, manipulating the cup from which she has taken her morning draught of tea, looks at the various forms and shapes that the leaves and dregs have taken, and deduces thence such simple horary prognostications as the name of the person from whom Posty will presently bring up the glen a letter or a parcel or a remittance of money, or as to whether she is likely to go on a journey, or to hear news from across the sea, or to obtain a good price for the hose she has knitted, or for the chickens or eggs she is sending to the storekeeper. Here the taint of a money payment is altogether absent, and no Highland spy wife or seer would dream of taking a fee for looking into the future on behalf of another person. It follows, therefore, that provided he or she is equipped with the requisite knowledge and some skill and intuition, the persons most fitted to tell correctly their own fortune are themselves, because they cannot pay themselves for their own prognostications, and the absence of a monetary taint consequently leaves the judgment unbiased. Undoubtedly one of the simplest, most inexpensive, and, as the experience of nearly 3 centuries has proved, most reliable forms of divination within its own proper limits is that of reading fortunes in teacups. Although it cannot be of the greatest antiquity, seeing that tea was not introduced into Britain until the middle of the 17th century, and for many years thereafter was too rare and costly to be used by the great bulk of the population, the practice of reading the tea leaves doubtless descends from the somewhat similar form of divination known to the Greeks as kotasos, by which fortune in love was discovered by the particular splash made by wine thrown out of the cup into a metal basin. A few spy wives still practise this method by throwing out the tea leaves into the saucer, but the reading of the symbols as they are originally formed in the cup is undoubtedly the better method. Any person, after a study of this book, and by carefully following the principles here laid down, may, with practice, quickly learn to read the horary fortunes that the tea leaves foretell. It should be distinctly understood, however, that teacup fortunes are only horary, or dealing with the events of the hour or the succeeding 24 hours at furthest. The immediately forthcoming events are those which cast their shadows, so to speak, within the circle of the cup. In this way the tea leaves may be consulted once a day, and many of the minor happenings of life foreseen with considerable accuracy, according to the skill in discerning the symbols and the intuition required to interpret them which may be possessed by the seer. Adepts like the Highland peasant woman can and do foretell events that subsequently occur. Practice and the acquirement of a knowledge of the signification of the various symbols is all that is necessary in order to become proficient and to tell one's fortune and that of one's friends with skill and judgment. There is, of course, a scientific reason for all forms of divination practised without hope or promise of reward. Each person carries in himself his own destiny. Events do not happen to people by chance, but are, invariably, the result of some past cause. For instance, in the last years a man becomes a soldier who had never intended to pursue a military career. This does not happen to him by chance, but because of the prior occurrence of that European war in which his country was engaged. The outbreak of war is similarly the result of other causes, none of which happened by chance, but were founded by still remoter occurrences. It is the same with the future. That which a person does today as a result of something that happened in the past, will in its turn prove the cause of something that will happen in the future. The mere act of doing something today sets in motion forces that in process of time will inevitably bring about some entirely unforeseen event. This event is not decreed by fate or providence, but by the person who, by the committal of some act, unconsciously compels the occurrence of some future event which he does not foresee. In other words, a man decrees his own destiny, and shapes his own ends by his actions, whether Providence rough hew them or not. Now, this being so, it follows that he carries his destiny with him, and the more powerful his mind and intellect, the more clearly is this to be seen the case. Therefore it is possible for a person's mind, formed as the result of past events over which he had no control, to foresee by an effort what will occur in the future as a result of acts deliberately done. Since it is given to but few, and that not often of intention, to see actually what is about to happen in a vision or by means of what is so-called the second sight, some machinery must be provided in the form of symbols from which an interpretation of the future can be made. It matters little what the method or nature of the symbols chosen is, dice or dominoes, cards or tea leaves. What matters is that the person shaking the dice, shuffling the dominoes, cutting the cards or turning the teacup, is by these very acts transferring from his mind, where they lie hidden, even from himself, the shadows of coming events which by his own actions in the past he has already predetermined shall occur in the future. It only remains for someone to read and interpret those symbols correctly in order to ascertain something of what is likely to happen. And it is here that singleness of purpose and freedom from ulterior motives are necessary in order to avoid error and to form a true and clear judgment. This is the serious and scientific explanation of the little understood and less comprehended action of various forms of divination having for their object the throwing of a little light upon the occult. Of all these forms, perhaps divination by tea leaves is the simplest, truest, and most easily learned. Even if the student is disinclined to attach much importance to what he sees in the cup, the reading of the tea leaves forms a sufficiently innocent and amusing recreation for the breakfast or tea table, and the man who finds a lucky sign such as an anchor or a tree in his cup, or the maiden who discovers a pair of heart-shaped groups of leaves in conjunction with a ring, will be suffering no harm in thus deriving encouragement for the future, even should they attach no importance to their occurrence, but merely treat them as an occasion for harmless mirth and badinage. Whether, however, the tea leaves be consulted seriously or in mere sport and love of amusement, the methods set forth in succeeding chapters should be carefully followed, and the significations of the pictures and symbols formed in the cup scrupulously accepted as correct, for reasons which are explained in a subsequent chapter. End of Chapter 1. Introductions to the Art of Divination from Tea Leaves. Chapter 2. Reading and Fortune-telling by Tea Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Charles Oldfield. Teacup Reading and Fortune-telling by Tea Leaves by a Highland Seer. Chapter 2. Ritual and Method of Using the Teacup. The best kind of tea to be used if teacup reading is to be followed is undoubtedly China tea, the original tea imported into this country and still the best for all purposes. Indian tea and the cheaper mixtures contain so much dust and so many fragments of twigs and stems as often to be quite useless for the purposes of divination, as they will not combine to form pictures or symbols clearly to be discerned. The best shape of cup to employ is one with a wide opening at the top and a bottom not too small. Cups with almost perpendicular sides are very difficult to read, as the symbols cannot be seen properly, and the same may be said of small cups. A plain-surfaced breakfast cup is perhaps the best to use, and the interior should be white and have no pattern printed on it, as this confuses the clearness of the picture presented by the leaves, as does any fluting or eccentricity of shape. The ritual to be observed is very simple. The tea drinker should drink the contents of his or her cup so as to leave only about half a teaspoonful of the beverage remaining. He should next take the cup by the handle in his left hand, rim upwards, and turn it 3 times from left to right in one fairly rapid swinging motion. He should then very slowly and carefully invert it over the saucer and leave it there for a minute, so as to permit all of the moisture draining away. If he approaches the oracle at all seriously, he should during the whole of these proceedings concentrate his mind upon his future destiny, and will that the symbols forming under the guidance of his hand and arm, which in their turn are, of course, directed by his brain, shall correctly represent that what is destined to happen to him in the future. If, however, he or she is not in such deadly earnest, but merely indulging in a harmless pastime, such an effort of concentration need not be made. The willing is, of course, akin to wishing when cutting the cards in another time-honoured form of fortune-telling. The cup to be read should be held in the hand and turned about in order to read the symbols without disturbing them, which will not happen if the moisture has been properly drained away. The handle of the cup represents the consonants and is akin to the house in divination by the cards. By this fixed point, judgment is made as to the events approaching the house of the consonants, journeys away from home, messages or visitors to be expected, relative distance, and so forth. The advantage of employing a cup instead of a saucer is here apparent. The bottom of the cup represents the remote future foretold, the side events not so far distant, and matters symbolized near the rim those that may be expected to occur quickly. The nearer the symbols approach the handle in all three cases, the nearer to fulfillment will be the events prognosticated. If this simple ritual has been correctly carried out, the tea leaves, whether many or few, will be found distributed about the bottom of the sides of the cup. The fortune may be equally well told whether there are many leaves or few. But of course there must be some, and therefore the tea should not have been made in a pot provided with one of the patent arrangements that stop the leaves from issuing from the spout when the beverage is poured into the cups. There is nothing to beat one of the plain old-fashioned earthenware teapots, whether for the purpose of preparing a palatable beverage or for that of providing the means of telling a fortune. End of Chapter 2. Ritual and Method of Using the Teacup.